This is our second spring webinar hosted by the Science for Success Soybean Group. Today's webinar will be geared towards economic uncertainties, and I think we have a lot of really great content to share with you today in this webinar. I've got a few housekeeping items that I'd like to mention before we begin. As we proceed through the webinar, please keep an eye on the chat function in your Zoom window. You can find this on the Zoom toolbar, most likely at the bottom of your screen. But we'll be sharing references to some of the information that we discuss in the chat throughout the webinar today. Also, please utilize the Q&A or the question and answer function that's also found on that same kind of Zoom toolbar, most likely at the bottom of your screen, to ask any questions that you have during the webinar and at the end of the webinar. We're going to have some time allotted to answer some of the questions that you may or may not have as they come up through our discussion today. We will have speakers and a panelist, answer these questions as much a lot of time as we've got. And the last thing that I wanted to mention before we get started is throughout the talks, we'll have some various polls appear. You'll see it come up on your screen. We ask you to please participate in some of these polls if you're able to do so. All the responses will be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about anybody knowing who you are, but it's kind of fun just to kind of see where the poll questions, what the answers we get from that. So in this webinar today, we have 5 different panelists and one main speaker of the 5. The speakers or panelists today will be Dr. Paul Mitchell from the University of Madison, Wisconsin, Dr. Shawn Conley from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, Dr. Seth Naeve from the University of Minnesota, Dr. Nicole Fiorellino from the University of Maryland, and myself, Michael Plumblee from Clemson University. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over now, the webinar, to Dr. Paul Mitchell to share some of the information with us on our topic for today.
All right, thanks, Michael. And thanks for the opportunity to present everyone here. It's my understanding this is more of a national audience, and I work here in Extension as an ag economist on the cropping side. And so it'll have somewhat of a Wisconsin focus at times, but more than anything, I'm kind of trying to push it to more a national context. So we'll get going here. First, gotta get this to work. So that's our panelists. There we go. So here we go. I'm going to kind of try to do 3 things. I'll keep an eye on the time, and we'll pause. I want to leave time for questions and stuff. So first, I'm going to talk about the U.S. farm income from the big national level and commodity support. This is the big sort of aggregate level stuff. Then we'll move in on to expected margins for corn and soybeans here for 2025. And we'll be focusing on soybeans, but here in the Midwest, as well as other places, but soybean is rotated with corn. And so it kind of, those two come hand in hand in big chunks of our Midwestern cropping systems, as well as other ones. We'll talk about those margins, the price minus the cost. We'll look at that. And then as time allows, we'll kind of talk about that current farm financial situation and what's going on at the farm level, which my understanding is a bunch of you are farmers, and so you're going to be dealing with some of these things now. So we'll get started here. Farm income and commodity support. Regularly, the USDA puts this out. This one came out in early February, and this is the U.S. net farm income for the 2004 all the way up to 2025. This is the forecast for the coming year. And what I've done here is put in the 20-year average and then the actual USDA forecast there. And so that very big peak is at 2022, then it came down in 2023. 2024 was another drop there. But here comes the 25 forecast. It's a big jump up, well above that 20-year average. And there in the big box, 2025 forecast for net farm income is up 26% from the forecast for 24. They still haven't quite finalized that 24 forecast. But you can see up 26% from last year's income. And this is 45% above the 20-year average. And this is net farm income for the whole U.S. ag economy. This is everything from corn and soybeans, but also livestock, as well as apples in Washington and cotton and everything. So we want to look at where this is coming from. And this again is that same USDA page. These are nominal cash receipts, and then the percentage changes I'll have in there just to kind of, it's busy with lots of numbers and stuff. But what on the left are the crops, and on the right is livestock. And this, again, is the whole ag economy here. And then we got 2023, then 24 forecast, and then the 25 forecast. And so we'll start on the top left there with crops. All crops, the revenues, this is cash coming into the farms, farm gate receipts, they call it, or cash receipts. From 23 to 24 is down 10.5%, and then 24 to 25, they're almost another 5% decline in cash receipts coming into farmers from crops. Corn, it was down 16, down another 4% for 25. Soybeans, again, down 16%, down almost 7% for 25 from last year. Fruits and nuts and vegetables are up a bit, but then you got your other big commodities. Wheat is down 2 years in a row. Cotton had a big loss and recovered some of it, but it's still much, it's still only $5.8 billion, much below, well below the 7.1 billion they had in 2023. You go to the right, and we're looking at livestock, and you can see 6% from 23 to 24, a 6+% increase. But the projection for 25 is down 1%, and those are in real dollars right there. These figures are the nominal changes, and so beef is a big one. Cattle and calves up 7% from 23 to 24, down a tiny bit from 24 to 25. Dairy up 10%, almost 11, up another 3%. Broilers up 5%, up another 3% for 25. Hogs up 6, now up another 5%. Eggs, you've seen that's been in the news a lot. Big jump from 23 to 24. That's kind of slowing down there. They're actually projecting a decrease. But what you see is we have this big, you go back a slide, we got this big jump in net farm income coming as forecasted, but there's not big changes. In fact, there's kind of declines in the crops and in the livestock. And when you convert it all to real dollars, $20, adjusting for inflation, where's it all coming from? It's coming from these direct government payments. This is the estimate for 2025, but the projected net farm income increase is mostly due to direct farmer payments. Right now, what the USDA put out here, and this when it came out on February 6th, is a $42.4 billion in spending on these direct payments to farmers. That's the second highest we've ever seen it. We'll look at the numbers here in a bit, but the only other time it was this big was back in 2020 during the heart of the pandemic was just getting going, and we thought the world was ending. We had all kinds of stuff with crops in the fields being unharvested, animals being euthanized, et cetera. We have big pandemic assistance and PPP loans and stuff like that. But you can really see for 25, they're looking at almost $36 billion in that gray box. That's these ad hoc payments. We'll talk about that some more. But that one light green box at the bottom is conservation payments at about $5 billion. And then there's that $1.66 billion. That's ARC PLC and the dairy margin program, dairy margin coverage. So you can see that's where the money's coming from. There's this big gray box of programs. And we'll go into that in more detail here, but eventually. What I first want to do, and these are the legend's a little goofy, but the top number there is the net farm income in real dollars. These are all $2025, where you can correct for all that inflation. And the brown number at the bottom is these direct farmer payments in real dollars again. And on the right there is 181 billion is what we're projecting for net farm income for the 25 year. 4.4 billion there, 42.4 billion is the government payments. But you can see this is the history of net farm income and government payments in modern U.S. agriculture since 1933. On the far left there, you can see there was a big boom in net farm incomes in real sense back there in the 40s, right after sort of just at the end of World War II and into the early 50s, a big boom. I was a child in the 70s, and there's that big spike we saw there. There's 2-3 years of really high net farm income. Then you see that big drop in the 80s. And then since the 80s, it's been on sort of an upward trend there. And you can see where we are now. That peak that there's there at 2022 is the highest we've ever seen it. And then this year is right up there. Projection for 25 is this high net farm income. There you can see the government payments at the bottom. And it's kind of hard to see all the details. We'll zoom into this last 20 years. But I really wanted you to kind of see where this 25 is fitting in relative to the long-term history you might have heard from other people. But the one thing I'd like to point out is how this net farm income has really been on an upward trend since the 80s when we had the farm crisis. But you've really noticed is it's gotten very volatile. Especially since about 2000, it jumps up and down a lot more. It used to be the swings were not as extreme as they really have been lately. So we're zooming in here to the last 20 years, same numbers again, but we have the 20-year average. And so the farm income's on the top, the same 181.1, the 42.4 in brown for the net farm or from the government payments. But you can see how we've been coming down the last few years, yet we're still well above that 20-year average. Yet there's still a lot of economic distress out there. And so it's been I was actually getting a little nervous about farm payments coming out that we've been talking about here, given that the farm income was so high above the 20-year average. And so were they really going to make these payments of the 42 billion, or were they going to make it more reasonable? More like they've been. If you really look at that bottom line, the brown line for the last several years, you can see how back, and it's been fairly constant at about that same, about 13, 14, 15, I guess that line is probably 25 billion maybe. That line at the bottom, how it's been very flat. And then during the pandemic, it went up, and then we come back to that. Then all of a sudden you see this big bump up for 25 in farm payments. So this is kind of an extreme year in terms of direct government payments to farmers relative, if you look at that brown line over the last several years. The last time it was big was during the pandemic, and before that, it's been years since we've seen any kind of payments like that level. Just to get a sense of how much net farm income is a part of, or how much direct government payments are a part of net farm income. These are the numbers. This is the 20-year average. It's 17.4%. So that blue line, on average, over the last 20 years, it's been 17.4% has been from direct government payments. The forecast for 25 is almost 24%. So it's a slightly above average year in terms of the role of government payments in net farm income. So what we've seen is net farm income has been high the last few years, above the 20-year average, even without government payments. We're looking at some really high government payments being projected for the 2025 to the point that it'll actually raise net farm income to the second highest we've ever seen in terms of government payments, but also very high net farm income. Yet, nevertheless, despite this large number, we've got still a lot of economic distress among farmers. It's high due to these natural disasters. I'm thinking the hurricanes, but we'll talk about these negative margins for crop farmers, and that's really been been the sources of economic stress. So now what I want to do is kind of zoom into where this direct government payments are for this year, what's coming, and just give us a better sense of things. So that's why I've highlighted the little square there around that 35.7 and the other two boxes there. Where's it coming from? So we'll talk some about that. First thing is ARC payments are likely in 2025. The USDA was back in February projected $865 million worth of ARC payments going out across the nation for all the different crops that receive ARC payments. This would be the county ARC most likely. It won't show up in 2025 until after the 2024 marketing year ends for various crops. So like for soybeans, that's going to be in probably October after the marketing year ends August 31st. So it takes a little while to process them. But the March WASDE, the World Ag Supply and Demand Estimates, came out for marketing year average prices just on the 11th, so just a few days ago. And given those prices and the way the ARC program is set up, if your county has even modest declines in yields, like 4% for soybeans and corn, and once you start going beyond that 4% decline in county average yield, you're going to be triggering ARC payments in your county. Wheat, it's only 3%. So, and we've had a lot of there were some dry counties last summer in different parts of the nation. And so if your county is one of those, you're likely to receive some modest, or not giant, but some modest ARC payments. That's part of that 1.66 billion that's in that figure for the coming year, where that money is coming from this year. So you kind of see that one, but the real source is that gray box, the large amount of money coming in from what they're calling ad hoc programs. Back in December, just before Christmas, the Congress, and then it was signed into law, was the American Relief Act of 2025, passed in 2024, but they called it the Relief Act of 2025. Included $10 billion for the emergency economic assistance, another $21 billion for agricultural disaster assistance. And then they also extended the Farm Bill. So that's where we just learned these acronyms, new administration, so we get some new acronyms from USDA. It's going to be a program called ECAP, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then the Farm Bill extension gives us ARC and PLC. So the program, it sounds like the Secretary Rollins announced it at the Commodity Classic in March 2nd, so it's been in the news some. You might have seen it. They're going to call that gray box, these programs, it seems to be going to be called ECAP, Emergency Commodity Assistance Program. It seems like it's going to encompass both that $10 billion in commodity support and the $21 billion disaster aid. From Secretary Rollins' comments, it seems the FSA is on track to begin applications on or before March 20th. That's the deadline is coming up at around that time. They had 90-day deadline. So at that point, she was confident that we'll be on track to start seeing those payments. So I guess next week you might be hearing about it from your FSA office. What they're talking about is it's going to be on planted acres. And so you're going to receive pre-filled applications for these ECAP payments based off your 2024 acreage reports that you already filed with FSA last year. And the other thing is the law has the process used for the payments fairly well defined. And so you've probably seen estimates of these in the various ag media that you follow. But we have not seen the official ECAP payment rates as of March 9th. I did not look this morning to see if they've been announced, but I think I might have seen it. But these are still approximate. I'm trying to say these are not official. They'll be somewhere in this region, though. And you've probably seen the literature out there in the media, slightly different numbers. But around 42.50 for corn, around 29.50 for soybeans, wheat a little over $30, cotton the big one. But for soybeans, you can see that we're talking about almost $30 is the pretty good guess about what they're going to be. And you should be hearing about these next week. That's that $10 million of the in that gray box. There are some reports that this ECAP will also encompass that $21 billion in disaster aid that for the hurricanes primarily. The official press release from USDA didn't quite make it clear, but what was clear in her public comments is that she wants it out very soon. They're not going to be wasting time, and it's going to get going. They kind of understand they need to get it out. There was a lot of media talking about using existing disaster programs, maybe. It's still not exactly clear. We're still waiting for the details, but some of the reports were saying that ECAP is going to encompass both of these programs. If not, it'll be something, it'll be another one. We just haven't seen the details yet, but I think you're going to hear about ECAP a lot here starting next week. And it will be that the disaster part of it's for a wide variety of disasters in 2023 and 2024, and will include livestock. So, but you can see the hurricane is the big one there, but there's also droughts, wildfires, floods, and et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff, and it's all things that are not covered by crop insurance. So wait for details, but that's where the direct government payments, that large gray box that are expected to move up farm income this year. The last one is ARC and PLC, the extension of the Farm Bill. You have until April 15th this year, so you got another month, but it's pretty standard. You've done this several times now. These are for base acres. This is not your planted acres, or you might call it program acres. You have different names, different parts of the country, but the technical document is base acres. Every state has different recommendations and such. In general, a lot of people are signing up for ARC. That's what I've been recommending for Wisconsin farmers. I have a web page for Wisconsin recommendations. You might have same things in your states for wherever you are. It's what'll happen is you're automatically, just like crop insurance, your 24 decisions will be in the new enrollment form. Will have your 24 decisions. If you want to change them, then you have until April 15th to make a change. So whatever you chose for your elections last year, you can automatically have them redone again for 25. Just connect with your FSA office, and if you want to make changes, you can. You just have an extra month because the bill passed late in the year. And I've been monitoring the markets and policies and update them as needed. So, the baseline came out on February 18th. It left the 2025 prices unchanged. They had $3.90 for corn, 10 for soybeans, 5.50 for wheat. USDA Ag Outlook Forum, February 27th. Seth Myers put out he's the chief economist of USDA. He has slightly more optimistic price for corn. The marketing average price for corn for 25 was 420 instead of 390. So that's a big jump, but everything else was still 10. So the only big thing left that might move the markets really is this prospective planning reports that'll come out here at the end of the month. And so if that throws us any surprises, they might update the marketing year average expectations for farm level prices from that 420 for corn and $10 for soybeans and the other crops. But I don't anticipate it. For Wisconsin farmers, I'm definitely recommending County ARC. Other states, other farmers, you'll have to connect with your local resources. But for our major, these grain crops, corn and soybean, there's been a lot of people have been electing the County ARC. So that's kind of the update on the farm policy at the big aggregate level. What I was going to do next is move in on the Midwestern scene, but it applies to other states as well. But we're going to look at the corn and soybean, the margins for 2025, the crop that, from what Michael said, is just getting started in South Carolina. But we've got some planning going on in some of the southern regions, but up in the upper Midwest, we have not yet. So we're still in the planning phase, I guess. So what I'm going to use are a couple of these budgets. University of Illinois has got a pretty good set of budgets they've been doing for a long time. Iowa State has a great long history of crop budgets. So we're going to use these. They have a fairly standardized process, so it's good to track changes over time. I've made pictures of these, track these margins over the years. But what I want to do is kind of use these margins to get a sense of where our major soybean and corn areas, what they are projecting for margins for corn and soybeans, and then kind of help us think about it more broadly. So I'm not going to go into details in the budgets. You want to them, you go ahead and take a look at them if you want. You can just Google crop budgets Iowa and you'll get those budgets. There's various for all kinds of different things, but they focus on the grain and forage crops. Illinois is very much on the grain crops. And Illinois breaks it northern and central, and there's a southern Illinois budget you can look at. I want to stay with the northern and central. And the Illinois breaks it into just like Iowa. They use corn after corn, corn after soybeans, and then they have soybeans. Northern Illinois in 2024, you can see the numbers there. And then the next column is what we had in 2025. These are projections for the coming year. Then that final column is how has the break-even price for soybeans and corn changed relative to 24. And so what you're seeing there is there's been some slight price changes, been some slight yield increases, and the farmers are cutting back on inputs. Is the expectation of these ag economists that put together these budgets in January and February. Down about 5%, 7% for soybeans and corn in northern Illinois, a little bit more like almost 10% for soybeans in central Illinois, down 7% for corn. Iowa State's got a fairly flat cost of production, break-even price needed for soybeans, but corn is down 5-6%. So that's a function of price changes on the inputs, but primarily changing the amount of inputs. Farmers are finding ways to cut back on inputs to deal with these prices that we're expecting. But you can see these are the break-even prices. Corn after corn's higher because you got a few more inputs, you got more weed or pest control inputs and more fertilizer, and you have a slightly lower yield on average typically. Then you have corn after soybeans and our soybeans budgets. What I want to really focus in on is the 2025 numbers there and try to make them a little brighter. And there's the projections for 2020 farm, the USDA's estimate of farm price, $4.20 for corn and $10 for soybeans. Don't need to be a PhD in economics to see, 420 is not anywhere near those break-even prices for corn. $10 is well below the 1130 or 1105 for soybeans in Illinois, 1115 in Iowa. So we're looking at negative margins, which I think a lot of you know, and people are expecting to be cutting back. And so these are the margins turned into cents per bushel in the top figure there for the northern Illinois, central Illinois, and Iowa. Or ticket times the yield expected for these places, the dollars per acre. So you can see corn after corn, or in Iowa or Illinois on the top there, about 65, 70 cents. Soybeans or corn after soybeans, 40 cents for Illinois, negative margin per bushel. About a break-even deal, 2 cents negative in Iowa. And then you got soybeans. You're looking at a shortage of $1.05 to $1.30, Iowa in the middle of those two. And what you got to think about, these are their best estimates of the full cost of production. This is paying for the land. Even if you own the land, you could have rented it out for whatever the going rate is around you. And that's buried in this break-even price. That also is paying yourself a living wage of sorts, whatever you consider. They got some numbers in these budgets. So think of this as that full cost of production. If you are owning the land and you're not renting it, if you have your land paid down mostly, you don't have a large mortgage, you can eat some of that cost and just say, well, I'm only going to earn $180 per acre on my land. Normally I could have rented it out for whatever, $250 or whatever's in your area. And you can deal with that. But some people can't deal with that if you actually have to pay the rent because you rented it, or you're highly leveraged. You've got a lot of land loans. So it depends on this. This is our best estimate of the break-even margin in dollars per bushel. You go down to the next one is dollars per acre. The corn after corn, 120, 150 loss per acre. Soybeans after corn, soybeans, $100 an acre. But that Iowa number is actually about a break-even deal. And then soybeans are, $70 to $90, depending on which state budget you're following. And these are these big kind of numbers like this are what behind these numbers. This is the expectations from the Ag Outlook Forum, USDA, put on in late February. This is from the chief economist, Seth Naeve. This is the projections for acreage in 2025. We'll find out in the acreage intentions report. It comes out at the end of March here, but they're projecting out over a 3 million acre increase in corn acres and a 3 million plus decrease in soybean acres at the national level. That's what's driving that. I'm going to go back a slide. It's this not too bad of a margin for corn relative to soybean, which is a much bigger loss. And so they're expecting this sort of a shift from corn or from soybeans into corn acres. The other one is wheat and cotton down there. There's about almost a million acre increase in wheat and about a million acre decrease in cotton. The other ones are fairly flat, like they've been in years. So you kind of see that. That's what the market's expecting. That's what's setting these prices you're seeing on the Board of Trade right now is on that. We get the acreage intentions report here at the end of the month. If those numbers and that come out much different than this, you're going to see some market adjustments. And so if you want to watch that, You can see if we get 91 million acres of corn, well, then there's going to be a push up in corn prices. If we get something, whatever we get, if they're much deviating from this, you're going to see some movement in the harvest time prices for corn and beans to compensate for what they're expecting. So that's sort of the big picture. But you go back to these are one person's guesses for, well, not one guess, but educated guess, we'll call it, for these regions in Illinois and this region in Iowa, the sort of state average. What really matters for you is your cost of production and not, these aren't your margins. You need to figure out your margins. And I don't ask me, what's the margin in Nebraska? What's the margin in North Carolina? What's the margin in Arkansas? I don't know. These are going to vary regionally. These are the big corn and soybean producing states, and these are the ones driving these large acreage shifts. They're anticipating is, there's going to be a slight movement. But these states have 10 million acres of each of these crops roughly, and so there's a lot of acres there. And what I've been emphasizing, this is a slide of prices received for Wisconsin farmers. The dates got changed and we pasted it into the template. And so on the far left these are the monthly average price for corn on the top, the monthly average price for soybeans in the bottom. And it goes back to 2010. So this is from 2010 each month all the way up to February of 2025 is the last one we have out, or it might be January. I guess it looks like it's January. And what you see there is the price of corn in Wisconsin, or the price of soybeans. We had that big run up in like the 2011, 12, 13, 14, and then it kind of disappeared. And then we saw the recent one with the COVID time there. 2020 started rising, and now we're coming down. But for years in there, from about 2014 till 2020, corn is bouncing around in the state of Wisconsin between $3 and $4. Soybeans is bouncing around between $8 and $10. We're kind of going back to that normal. We have this big jump in the early teens, and we had this big jump during COVID that we just gotten through. I've been saying we're kind of going back to normal. These spikes and stuff show up in the other data at the national level as well. I'm sure they kind of follow your regions wherever you are. So you kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here. I'm calling it, we're going back to farming like we had to do back before COVID. So we're stuck with these tight margins. And so what can a farmer do? We got crop management. You got to focus on things you can control. What can you control? What you're putting in, how you're managing your crop, commodity support programs. We talked about ARC and PLC and ECAP. I'll spend some time on crop insurance, and we'll talk a little bit about marketing, but I'm not a marketing economist. So we'll do a little bit there. But so this is a publication with the extension faculty at UW-Madison put together, sort of that's focused on economic resiliency, surviving these tough times, but also thinking about the future and how to be innovative as well. You can't always be in the lockdown mode. You have to be thinking about when the good times come, you got to be ready to jump on them, but you also got to stay innovative and on the frontier as well. And so what this is 16 pages of the collective wisdom of the Wisconsin Extension faculty on the crop side. So it's corn, soybeans, and forage is our big focus there. But you've got, like myself, I do the economics, Dr. Conley does the soybean side on the crop management, so the agronomics, but there's a weed person, weed management, there's insect and disease management, there's machinery ideas on there, all of our specialists. And I'd call it the collective wisdom of sort of good ideas to be sustainable in the economic sense. You can be there to survive economically, but also how to be innovative. And what we've been telling people is go through this list. There's maybe 75 to 100 ideas in there. Find a couple that you probably do a bunch of them, but find a couple, 3 to maybe think about trying. And you're not going to be able to do them all, but it gives you a sense. And I'm guessing all your states, the people from other states will have something similar. Your extension faculty, different states. It's not like this is just the Wisconsin one. We'll have a Wisconsin focus. There's ideas from your other extension faculty and other people at the various places you get your information from. Talking about sort of that resiliency, surviving tough times. Wisconsin has a lot of these materials on cash flows, estimating your cost of production. There's budgets and how to adapt a budget so you know your break-even cost. Cash flow analysis. You're not selling as much grain. You're gonna have more cash. So what are you gonna do? How are you gonna make it through some of these times when your payments are due? Are you gonna have to sell grain? Extension has the budgeting tools as well, the crops and soil side. One of the big ones is machinery cost estimates. And Iowa State is a center for excellence for that. They've got a pretty good system there for estimating your machinery costs. A lot of people, when they're starting their budgets, will use something like a custom rate survey or something you get from a crop budget for your state. But what really matters is I need my equipment, my tractor on my fields. That's what you can kind of work through with this system to work out what's it actually costing you to use, the size of tractor you use, the age it is, and the kind of equipment you're using to come up with your cost of production for moving, doing whatever you do for tillage or planting or whatever. That's a pretty good one. And then on the marketing side a little bit, I think University of Minnesota's got some good stuff. Their Center for Farm Financial Management has someone, Ed Ussett works for them. He's got a pretty good stuff on how to do a marketing plan. But really, you can see what they do. And I think those of you who already work with marketing companies or organizations, you have some ideas. Some of you don't do it yourself. You might find these tools useful. But if not, if you do want to work with someone, your marketing plan will look something like what Ed has there on his webpage. You get some templates and stuff and get a sense of what they look like. And I think marketing is very important this year, as it is most years. And the other thing I like to emphasize is all these tools make it easier. They don't make it easy. They just make it easier. These are ways to do it, but it's fairly tedious to sit down and figure out your machinery cost of production or to develop a marketing plan. On the economic side, to think about making innovative changes to try to take advantage of new opportunities and stuff, we kind of have a couple different tools, and this is the parts I wrote up. There's something called partial budget analysis. Some of you probably had this or know about it. It's a very common tool used in agriculture. It's kind of a back of the envelope calculation. There's an example there, and you can easily type in partial budgeting on Google, and you'll find some, agriculture partial budgeting or farm partial budgeting. You'll find some tool resources. But essentially, it's for small changes. Like, you got a 500-acre operation of corn, 500 acres of soybeans. Here's an extra 40 that comes up. It's just a small change. Is it worth it? You kind of go through what revenues go up, what revenues go down, what costs go up, what costs go down, and kind of figure out the net benefit. Or it's like, what about using a seed treatment? Do I want to spend the extra $5 an acre for whatever seed treatment that you're looking at? Kind of help you pencil that out and see. A lot of it's common sense, but it formalizes the process. It helps you think about it carefully and more formally just to make sure you're not missing something. But if you really want to be innovative, sometimes you need something bigger. That's more of a business plan. Here's a couple examples here. Again, just type in farm or agricultural business plan in Google. You'll find something, or your local people have something. These are Wisconsin oriented, or the SARE one, this last one is more of a general one for everybody. But it's the same idea. If you want to do something bigger, like take out, 20% of your crop acres are not very productive land and put in pasture and start doing beef cattle. You see all these beef prices and I've never done beef. Everyone seems to be making money. I'm going to try it. Let's do a business plan to see if it's a good idea. Cash flow it. Often you're seeking credit from somebody. Well, they like to see you got a plan, not just a back of the envelope calculation. There's some of those tools that do things like that. And I like to emphasize, these make it easier. They don't make it easy. It's still tedious and a lot of work on your part. The last thing I want to kind of do in this section is talk about crop insurance. And crop insurance it's an essential part of a lot of operations now. We get a lot of acres are insured. What I'm going to review here is some typical practices used for crop insurance, and you kind of try to regionalize a little bit so you can see what's going around in your area. If you're doing something else, what I emphasize to our farmers is be sure you've thought about it and have a good reason for doing it, because everyone else in your region tends to do blank. Are you doing something different? Well, then make sure you've thought about it, that it actually works for you. But everyone else seems to try whatever this other thing is. Well, maybe I should take a look at that. But the big one is, I think most of you know it, revenue protection is by far the most popular policy, RP. It does price and yield protection simultaneously. I always tell people it means you'll have the grain or the money to buy grain at harvest time prices to satisfy any contracts you have or to feed the livestock, which I think of as a forward contract. You got to feed your livestock. Revenue protection is by far 90+% of our acres in Wisconsin and a lot of states in the upper Midwest is revenue protection. The other thing I emphasize is enterprise units. If you can get them, you take certain sizes and certain acres to qualify. It's the lowest cost option to get a nice revenue floor for your whole operation for all your soybeans or all your corn. If you do have highly variable land, you might try to break it up into optional units. Because like you have a wet area and a dry area and a lighter soiled area. In a wet year, the wet area does poorly, the dry area does well. In a dry year, the wet area often does better and the dry area does poorly. Well, on average, they always work out to be about the same, so you don't get any enterprise units don't pay. So you might want to break it into these optional units. You're going to pay more for insurance, but it might make more sense for your operation. But in general, revenue protection for enterprise units. The other question is coverage levels. And so this maps shows what they call the acreage weighted revenue protection coverage level. And so like say there's 6 farms, you got 5 of them have 100 acres of soybeans and 1 has 500 acres of soybeans. They choose the average. You just take the simple average, you're going to get that's not weighted. But that 500 acres farmer, let's say he chooses 85% coverage and the other ones all choose 80%. You take the average of those numbers, you're going to get a little bit above 80%. But because that farmer does 500 acres and the other five farmers do 500 acres total, then when you acreage weight it, you just get the simple average and you're going to get 82.5% as the average between 80 and 85%. That 85% gets more weight in the calculation. What you'll see here is it's very clear that in the upper, that sort of that soybean corn belt across southern Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, a little bit into Michigan or Ohio, that's where people are buying 80, 85% coverage. That's the weighted average is 81 to 85%. Then right around it is that purple area, that's that 76 to 80% coverage level. And then the blue area is that 70 to 75%. And then you get into those lighter colored areas. And what you'll see is some of these places that have in that same area, like Wisconsin has, that 70 to 76 to 80%. So say 75 or 80% is pretty common. And I think whereas you get further away, you get to that like the Carolinas across the south there, they much lower coverage levels. Same out in the Great Plains there. You get the blue where it's more like 70, 75, just like you see in sort of the more northern or northeastern regions of Wisconsin and some of these other states. As you get out of that heart, you start buying a little bit lower coverage. And that's pretty typical. You can see some of these areas are more in that 50, 55, 60%, 65% of some of these areas. So this is what's common in these areas, and you can find your county or counties on there and ask yourself, if you're doing something very different from this, is there a good reason for it? The other one you might see is the harvest price exclusion. One way to reduce your cost of insurance is to do revenue protection with the harvest price exclusion. And what essentially it doesn't update it. So like the soybean price for the 2025 is 10.54. Let's say we have a drought and price of soybean shoots up to like $12 a bushel. You would update all your guarantees with an extra $1.50 of guarantee. So all your revenue guarantees per acre jump up. That's the traditional revenue protection. HPE doesn't allow that. They just keep your original guarantee with the 10.54. And it works. It's very popular to choose that HPE if you're out away from these areas that aren't very tied to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So you can see that upper Midwest, this map is kind of flipped around. Just say the darker it is, the more you use traditional revenue protection. So over 90% of people in those dark counties are using traditional revenue protection. But then as you get out of those areas, you start to see those light green and those blue areas. Those are farmers who are using the revenue protection HPE. This is in 2017, but I don't think it's going to be a whole lot different. You can see like upstate New York, it's not very tied to the Chicago Mercantile. But look at that Delmarva area and parts of Virginia and over into North Carolina. They're still I think there's a lot of livestock feed there, and those contracts for delivering the feed are tied to Mercantile Exchange numbers. And so those farmers find revenue protection, the traditional one, still valuable. But once you get out of those areas, you're using it yourself. It's a way to save some money. Think about doing RP, HPE if you're in one of these areas that's blue or light green, if you're not already doing so. You have to think about it. It's not saying it's for everybody, but that's what some people in your area are doing. The other thing you might be hearing more about this year is ECO, enhanced coverage option. A traditional policy is I'm looking at the figure there. You have this farm level coverage. You got 0 up to, say, in this example, 75% revenue protection. So you take your average yield times that price, like 10.54 this year. That's your guarantee. That's 100%. That's your expected revenue, and the insurance picks up to 75% of that is what you're locking in is that revenue floor. Well, that deductible is that first 25% of losses. This ECO allows you to insure part of that deductible, but you use a county policy. It's not your yield, it's the county yield. It's the same price, but it's the county yield. And what's different, why you might be hearing more about ECO this year, is the premium subsidy is much higher than it was. It used to be in like the 40-some, lower 40s. Now it's going to be just like SEO. It's 2/3 of the premium is going to be covered by the subsidy. So the prices of ECO are going to be much lower you'll noticeably lower than they were last year or other years. And so people are looking at this as a way to cover their shallow losses. What happens if the prices decline 5%, 8%, or my yields are just a little short? I'm not going to trigger a revenue protection payment, but the county level might change. So I'll get some shallow loss coverage. And some people are thinking about it. So I'm going to that's the corn map and the figure. I'll come back to it, but you see a lot of red. I'm going to go right to the soybean one. And what you see here on the top right of that bar graph, that's the soybean planted acres, the percent of them using SCO, ECO, or this hurricane insurance. I forget HIP stands for hurricane. I forget the name, HIP, but the wind debt. It's a hurricane insurance protection, if I remember right. We don't have it in Wisconsin, so I just learned about it. They're all very similar. They're using part of your deductible is being covered with the county level policy. What you see back in 2020 when SCO and WI showed up, and then how many soybean acres at the US level have been covered. And what you'll see is that growth in ECO has become the preferred policy in terms of acres covered. And we go back to corn, it's even stronger in corn. And you really notice SCO has really dropped off in 24, see it in both corn and soybeans. What's going on is people are jumping in this ECO, and I think you're going to hear about it more if you. I mean, the date's coming up here very quick. You got to make your decisions, but you've probably heard about it. A lot of people are thinking about it. Is it worthwhile? That's the big question. Here's some data that just came out from the Farm Doc folks at University of Illinois. This is the returns to ECO at 95% for dryland soybeans 2015 to 2023. Generally a loss, but some areas it turns out to pay off. And this is under the old subsidy program. But you can see parts of Kansas, Nebraska, big chunks of that pay off. North Dakota, big parts of Michigan. There's a little chunk there in that the driftless area, southeastern Minnesota, northeastern Iowa, southwestern Wisconsin. There's those areas that pay off, but there are also a lot of red areas where, on average, it doesn't pay. You put more money in a premium than you get back out in payments, but it still does provide coverage for shallow loss, which has some value to people. So some of you might be looking at that or hearing about it or thinking about it. If you're in those HIP wind index insurance, you can't have both of them. You get HIP or you get ECO. You can't do both. So that's that. I want to quickly do some farm financial situation conditions fairly quickly and be done for some questions. I want to leave time for questions. So this is 2010 through 2024. This is USDA estimates of farmland value at the national level, the average across the U.S. Growth in the 2010 through 2014, we had those high commodity prices, then years of nothing much happening in land values, and then they jumped up in 2020 through the today. Almost a 33, jumped a third here in the last few years. From 2020 to 2024, cropland went up 37% nationally, farm real estate overall 33%. So big jumps, but that's over. This is our 7th district, the Chicago Federal Reserve. They put out month or quarterly estimates of how much the land values have increased from the previous year ago. And so that 2010 through 2015, these are all big increases from a year before in the 7th district for good farmland. Then it went down about 2014, it stopped. Then from 2015 through 2020, very little percentage changes. And then we had this big run up in the last few years, and that's over. We're done having land value increases. So that's the estimate right now. That's the 7th district. You can look at your own regions and get some estimates. But in general, I would be telling people if what's keeping you in farming is the land value increases, keeping your balance sheet healthy, you're not going to be looking at that anymore. I think we're really seeing a slowdown in land values. What that comes with is making more difficulty in loan repayments and loan demand. And so this is the 7th district on top. The next one down below is the Kansas City district. The maps are on the bottom there. It's the same figure, basically. It's the same data, but different places. But I'm going to look at sort of like that 2013, 14, 15 is that blue line is on top, and then the brown line's on the bottom. Blue line is loan demand. The brown line is loan repayment. And then you notice about 2020, it switches over. The brown line's on top and loan repayment or loan demand is on the bottom. And we just switched around again. This is just evidence from the talking to ag lenders that for a while there before COVID, farmers were in really tight margins. They weren't getting their revolving lines of credit paid off. The loan demand was high. They weren't making payments as much as they could. Then the prices went up. They all started making payments, and we switched back around to this tight negative margins. It's showing up at the ag lenders. They're telling the Federal Reserve Bank, yes, our farmers are struggling. And that's more than just those regions. This is estimate average lending rate for interest rate here in the 7th district for big chunks of Wisconsin. It's creeping down slowly. It's 7.2%, 7.8% for real estate or operating loans. That's their estimate at the end of 2024, the 4th quarter. The one that really surprised me, and this is the Minneapolis one, is how many farmers are sitting on loans that are adjustable rate mortgages, in essence, adjustable loans. They have to go back in and go refinance them again. On the left is the figure. You see the number there, $4 billion of farmland loans will be repriced at higher interest rates in 2024. That's $4 billion of loans. The figure on the bottom left there is what percent of the farm loan portfolio at these banks and that's in that district are going to be in these adjustable ones where they have to be refinanced sometime. You can see that bar on the right, 45% are more than half of their loan portfolios in these kind of loans. And when are these loans due? This is at the end of November last fall. Within the next 6 months, about 50%, some in the next 7 to 12 months, some a year and a half, 13 to 18 months. But more than 18 months out, there's still almost 45% of loans are in these. And so these new higher interest rates are going to start biting. And so they're talking about $4 billion worth of refinancing these loans. That's one extra percentage point interest is $40 million. You add a couple three, there's $120 million. That's just an interest cost in that district. And now I haven't got similar data, no one else has them, but what's going on in the other districts, I don't know. But that was a surprise. Here's the farm bankruptcy filings. You can kind of see were high going into COVID, and they really slowed down. This 2024 is the first time we're seeing a lot more filings of farm bankruptcies again, the first upswing in a long time. We're up 55% from 23. We're still low relative to 2019, but more evidence that there's some headwinds and some farms are struggling. Nevertheless, this is this ag barometer. Farmers are still optimistic. On the left is sort of the ag economy barometer that came out at the end of February. The number is an index, but it's up. It's high like it was back in as the prices shot up during COVID. On the right here is the brown is current conditions. The green is future expectations. Farmers are pretty optimistic, higher than they've been in a while, back during those high price periods of the early COVID pandemic. In 2021, 22, we were seeing some pretty good prices. What's on their mind for concerns on policy? Let's look at that top left, or on the left side there, 44% were concerned about trade policy. This is in February. How many of you think there's a trade war going on? Likely and very likely it was 46% of farmers in this survey back in February. At the end of February came out. So you kind of get a sense this is not a surprise. Very still generally optimistic though. So I'm done with the big story here. Farm financial situation remains solid, but it's weakening. They're facing headwinds. Land values are flattening. Interest rates are slow to fall. Loan repayment is slowing down. Bankruptcies are up. Nevertheless, farmers are fairly optimistic still. As of February, projected net farm income looks promising. That ECAP is coming out, and that'll really help. Margins are thin, telling people to focus on the things you control, management of your crop, getting into these programs and the information's out there, get your crop insurance optimized. You got another day here. And get your marketing plan, figure out your marketing. So I'm going to be done there. I know it went pretty fast, but there you go. So we'll take some questions.
Yes, thank you for all that, Paul. Some good information, especially going into this cropping year. If you will advance your slide one more time, Paul, we don't want anybody to miss out on CCA credits if you did participate today to get those. So we do have a QR code that you can scan. If you're not set up on the app, if you'll send your CCA number to get the CEUs to the email address that's listed there, we'll make sure you get taken care of. And we also have an evaluation survey for today, but please hold on and ask any questions that you may have. We'll start the question and answer portion now with some of our other panelists on here. I know we've had a few questions come through the chat during our webinar today, but I guess we'll just kind of jump into some of these questions here and try to get some answers here before we get off for the day. So I guess the first question that came through, Paul, how much influence do other countries' production, something like Brazil or South America, will play on U.S. prices and margins?
That's Brazil. There's a slide, and there's a way to get to it, but I think the one thing that's really Brazil is now the world's largest soybean producer. They have their yields are basically the same as ours at that average across at the national level. They produce, I think it's 36, 37% of the world soybeans. We're down to 32 or something like that. They've really come on and their yields are at our level. So that's the supply. All this issues about trade and stuff. China is playing Brazil and the U.S. off each other because we both have a ton of soybeans to sell. And there's exchange rates and tariffs and all kinds of stuff all the world is going to be shopping around to find the cheapest soybeans. I mean, why wouldn't they? And so what Brazil has and their production is going to be very important. Everyone's going to be watching it. They produce a lot of soybeans. They have over 100 million acres of soybeans. We're hoping to get low 80s here. They're talking 100 million, and their yields are very similar to ours. So what's harder, their version of the USDA isn't as good as our version. They don't have as good a data. And so there's been lots of companies trying to figure it out with their satellite photos and trying to estimate what's going on. They have infrastructure problems and getting the soybeans from the field to the ports. The storage isn't as good. They got the roads and trucking. But the one thing that's been happening is they've been spending a lot of money, and other countries have been helping them, particularly China, investing in building their infrastructure. our infrastructure, when's the last time we spent billions of dollars on updating the locks and dams or our railroad system? But that's how we move our grain to port. So those are a major influence.
For sure. I guess another question that came in, and this has probably been one of the bigger issues I guess we've had like in the South and other places around the U.S. where we're growing a lot of soybeans. Um, says you mentioned ECO benefiting farmers with quote shallow losses. Is this what you would recommend for farmers with a lot of deer damage to soybeans? We see that a lot every year, a lot of wildlife damage down
Yeah,
here.
yeah. I remember I used to live in Texas. I worked with Texas A&M. There they had the wild hog problem, and it's it's going to shallow losses. Generally, it's a better deal if your yields track the county yield. And so if you have very land that doesn't track the county yield, ECO won't be as good. Um, and those shallow, so like if your area where the hogs seem to always hit or the deer and the county isn't bothered, you're not insuring anything that's going to help you. You're going to need individual coverage. But it also includes that it's that same Chicago Mercantile Exchange price. And so if the price declines 10%, that's not enough to trigger a yield, a revenue protection policy. But if that's still part of what you need for your margin to survive because you can't cash flow through a 10-15% decline, you might need to look at ECO. Or you got another day to rush out there. But I'm sure a lot of you and what people are sort of looking at is if I'm buying 80% coverage in my region, that sort of works for me. Maybe I should go back to 75 and buy some ECO. That's kind of what they're looking at. Is that a better deal for me? And that's I can't answer that question. You have to answer that question for yourself. But the tighter you're tied to the county yield, that's a better deal. And how much can you survive these shallow losses? Things like deer, if everyone in the county gets a lot of deer, then maybe it'll work. But if it's an individual thing, I would encourage you to think about individual coverage because you're the only one or you're one of 5-10% are hitting it hard. You want individual coverage.
Yeah, we definitely have region-wide deer damage here, pretty significant
Yeah,
every
certain
year.
parts of
So,
the certain counties, certain parts of certain
right.
counties.
And then another question that came through the chat, have heard rumors of banks not renewing farm loans. Have you heard that to be true or any issues moving forward that we should be aware of with that?
There's always rumors of that, and you saw those bankruptcy numbers. Those are the farmers that are getting officially filing Chapter 12 bankruptcy. Um, for every one of those farmers, there's someone out there that's getting hit with something like that. They're not going bankrupt, but they are definitely being squeezed. They might be liquidating some of the stuff, selling some of the land to refinance everything. And you're refinancing at higher interest rates, things like that. And so that tick up in Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings, that tick up in loan demand and drop off in loan repayment, that's what that is banks, maybe they have a revolving line of credit, maybe $100,000 revolving line of credit. They always pay some of it off, but they're getting a harder and harder time paying it off. And all of a sudden, like, man, I maxed it out. I can't cover it. Eventually they roll it, they have to refinance. But maybe the bank says, I don't think refinancing is a good option. Maybe we'll refinance, but you need to do something to generate some cash. And that might be selling some of your land or liquidating some of your something. And that's what I think you're hearing about. And definitely more of that's happening. Those aggregate data show that there are people having those hard conversations out there.
Yeah. We had another question come through the chat. Is the insurance price based on local elevator price or Chicago Board of Trade price?
It's all Chicago Board of Trade price, and that's why the coverage levels aren't always as good. Once you get away from that core of the sort of the traditional corn soybean belt, that's why coverage levels decline because it's just not as valuable. Unless you're like some of those livestock areas, or maybe the livestock contracts for the chicken and or the chicken slash egg, broilers and eggs and the hogs are tied to those board of trade prices. And that's what makes that harvest price exclusion valuable in some of those areas too, because they don't need to pay for that coverage. My price I get locally isn't that tied to the mercantile exchange. It's more tenuous, and so it that's definitely how the insurance is. It's tied to mercantile because you can just look it up. It's very easy to see. Everyone follows it. It's driven by big aggregate markets. So when the price soybeans are doing great in Brazil, it affects that mercantile exchange price, where the local price might not respond to those kind of factors.
I guess I've kind of got a question, I guess, for our panelists or just at least something to kind of see what's going on in your area. Like I know you talked a little bit or something that made me think of the question earlier, with where we're at in the farm economy, do you think that the fixed input or fixed costs is causing a lot of the hard acre issue, or the input cost price that like rebounded from COVID? And I know, like, I guess what makes me think of this is I knew some growers in our region that made a pretty good soybean crop last year, definitely paid for inputs, but there was still, just like nothing left after to pay a lot of fixed costs. And some of
Yeah.
this was the elevated equipment prices. And we still run a lot of older used equipment down in the South, but I know like maybe in the Midwest, Shawn, Seth, or even over in Mid-Atlantic, I mean, y'all seeing a lot of people trying to offload newer equipment, or have you seen any shift like that in your area?
They're not going to say anything, Conley or
Yeah, we hear the same kinds of things, but it's really hard to quantify that kind of discussion. So, there's a little bit less repair going on. There's definitely new purchases have basically stopped out there, but the the kind of desperate moves, you hear a few of these things, but I guess I can't really say explicitly what those numbers are.
I,
Yeah, I wasn't avoiding your question. I was just kind of really thinking if I saw or really kind of heard of a major shift and maybe like Seth said, not really appreciable that I could kind of quantify on a broad basis. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I get the feeling deferred maintenance is one of the first things that it's a cost you pay, and it's the first thing people put off. And when these budgets are tight, it's like, we're gonna get by another year with this equipment, and we're gonna defer some of the maintenance we would do. It's a way to save money. You can do that for a few years, but eventually catches up. And the thing on the machinery I think about is here, I don't know if it's making the news and down your way, Michael, but or out east, but John Deere's been, closing and shedding employees and stuff, and that's a sign that people aren't buying new equipment anymore. The John Deere has been really closing places and laying off lots of people.
I will say I know at University of Maryland Extension we actually just gained an employee from Atlantic, our local John Deere dealer, which almost never happens. We often lose
The other way around. Yes.
employee or extension employees to industry, and it was like kind of a noticeable shit. Wow, we actually gained someone from. So that was a little bit of a telling sign. Now that you mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that hits these communities pretty hard when a large manufacturer shuts down or cuts back substantially.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour here. I wanted to make another, I guess, couple announcements that we have the evaluation survey QR code up here. Please fill out the evaluation. This definitely helps us develop new materials and resources for you. If you do fill out the survey, you'll be included in a gift card drawing that will be done at the end of March. So, any of you that are interested in participating in that, we would greatly appreciate it. Also, we'd like to say visit our new Science for Success website for more information about us and the programs that we have. Sign up for our monthly newsletter so you never miss an event. Be sure to check us out on X or Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Definitely like to give a big thank you to all of you that attended today, our speakers that participated in this webinar, and Paul for leading a lot of the discussion. We'd like to also thank the United Soybean Board, our state soybean boards who supported a lot of the research that we do as a collaborative group, the Science for Success staff with Rachel, Haley, Bethany, and Michelle. And then we hope to see y'all again in the future at some of our Science for Success events.
Thanks, everyone.